Lindsey Hilsum, we're here to talk about the year ahead in geopolitics, in international relations. What are you going to tell me?
I'm going to tell you that 2023 is critical for Ukraine. They have to make more gains. They have to get as near to winning this war as they can, because the West may lose interest, and President Putin knows that time is on his side. If he can hold out, he can continue to weaken Ukraine and stop it from functioning as a country. We're going to talk about China turning inward, because President Xi's zero COVID policy has been a failure. And now we're talking about 1 million or more people potentially dying, and the economy being in a really bad state and really needing a boost this year. And we're going to talk about rogue elephants. Those are the things that maybe you're not looking at, and the places that maybe you're not looking at, but which could cause chaos in 2023.
Lindsey Hilsum, our international editor. We're going to look ahead to 2023. But first, I want to talk about a chat we had this time last year about your sort of predictions before 2022. To refresh your memory, we were speaking about Afghanistan. You predicting it to be another awful year there after the Western withdrawal, which was right.
That was easy enough, wasn't it? To say things were going to be pretty grim in Afghanistan.
You said that China would definitely not invade Taiwan, despite the increase in tension. Correct?
Phew.
And then with Russia-Ukraine, you said that you wouldn't say whether or not Putin would invade because there were arguments either way. So overall, I think you did pretty well.
Well, I hedged my bets on the big one, didn't I?
Yeah. But did the invasion of Ukraine by Putin in February, did that change your thinking behind how you saw geopolitics, or just how you saw Vladimir Putin himself?
It changed everything. It changed the world. It's changed the world for a generation. And so I didn't dare predict that he would do that. And, most Ukrainians didn't dare predict that he would do that either, because it just seemed impossible because it was so awful. But the Western intelligence agencies predicted that he would do that. And on this occasion, they were right.
Here we are then. Putin invaded, and we are still in the midst of this war. It seems to have sort of gone through different phases. First, the Russians advanced, then the Ukrainians had a counteroffensive. Where do you think we are now? Because, on New Year's Day, we saw the missile strikes from Ukraine that killed dozens of Russian soldiers. We're now seeing the Russians pummeling the town of Solidar near Bakhmut. What's your sense of the state of the war as we are now?
Well, I think, here we are at the beginning of 2023, and I am not Mystic Meg. I do not have crystal balls. I do not know what's going to happen. However, I think we can look at it and make a certain analysis. And I think that 2023 is really critical for the Ukrainians, because at the moment they have the momentum in this war. They are the ones who have retaken territory since the war began last February. And they also have the Western support. And at the moment, the Western support is solid. And they may be getting tanks, which Western countries haven't given them before. They may be getting British Challengers. They may be getting German Leopards. They may be getting Bradley fighting vehicles from the Americans. And because they proved to NATO countries that they could fight and they could push Russia back, there is a certain amount of faith in them. However, that doesn't mean it's all going to go their way, because they must do more this year. I don't know if we'll discuss what winning means, but I suppose what they have to do is push the Russians right back this year, because what Russia can do and is doing is digging in, and it's easier to defend than to attack. And in that sense, time is on Putin's side.
So if they get those tanks or the weapons that they require, how easier, if at all, would it actually make them to break down those defences?
Well, it doesn't make it easy. It will never be easy, and it depends really what their strategy is. So they could look south, and that is one possibility. In other words, they could start to really attack Crimea using missiles and using artillery. And that would make the Russians extremely angry, because Crimea is a territory that the Russians really, really do not want to give up. And it's the territory Ukraine really wants back. And it's a territory where previously the sort of NATO, European, American consensus was, well, maybe Putin can keep Crimea. That is not how the the Ukrainians look at it. Absolutely not. The Ukrainians at this point are determined to get Crimea back. And then you look at the Donbass in the east. Now, that really is a sort of buffer zone now, in the sense that it's very depopulated and it's trashed. I've been there. It's horrific, the destruction there. And so it's a question of whether the Russians will defend that to the last man, and whether Ukraine is determined to go back to the borders, not just before February 24th last year, but back to the borders before the Russian invasion of 2014. So it all hangs in the balance this year, because I don't think that the war is going to end this year. I think you're going to get to a point where the lines may freeze. But Western support for Ukraine, that may well ebb by the end of this year. And I think there'll be a lot of pressure on the Ukrainians to sue for peace.
In his New Year's message, we saw Putin speaking of moral and historical righteousness on his side. You know, analysts think that he might have further mobilization.
During his televised New Year message, Vladimir Putin again framed the war as an existential struggle. He said 2022 had brought clarity, quote, separated courage and heroism from betrayal and cowardice. In another New Year address last night, the man history will remember as the one who stayed, stuck to his message. That the goal remained not only the return of normality, but the return of all of occupied Ukraine.
What do you read into his thinking, especially when he sort of called that sort of brief ceasefire to mark the Orthodox?
Well, I mean,
Christmas?
Look, we're back to the days of Kremlinology, aren't we? Of trying to sort of figure out what the Russian leader thinks, because we don't know, and you just have to go on the outer signals. There's no question they are mobilizing more. There will be a spring offensive by the Russians. They will try and retake the territory that they've lost. There's the possibility that they may try and pull in Belarus and come down from the north again. But they are not going to give up and go away. Putin's entire political life is staked on Ukraine and what happens in Ukraine. And as far as we know, there's no effective opposition within the system in Russia. And he knows that time is on his side. He has to hold out. And so the least he will do is hold out, even if he can't push back.
If this war goes on to the end of this year and beyond, the West hasn't got the abilities not just to keep on providing for Ukraine, but to shore up its own defences. Why is it that that's possibly the case? I mean, shouldn't Russia, with all these sanctions, be in much dire straits?
Well, Russia still has oil, and the oil price is still high, although it may start to dip now. And also, the rest of the world does not look at this conflict in the same way as the West does. And I think this is one of the things which, if you're watching and reading the Western media, and we may be as guilty of this as anybody else, you have the sense that everybody thinks that Russia is the aggressor and Ukraine is the victim, and this is a noble fight for democracy. But if you look across vast parts of Africa and Asia, they don't look at it like that. In Africa, in general, rather than seeing this as I would see it, which is as a war of imperial reconquest, Russia trying to get back its old empire, they see it completely differently, because they see it as the West fighting the Russians, who supported them in their liberation struggles against colonialism in the 1960s. And Russia has been very effective in its propaganda and its reach, certainly across Africa and much of Asia too.
This time last year, we were talking about, and often you talk about Western intervention, the sort of Afghanistan is an example of, not just Joe Biden's failure, but the failure of Western intervention. Arguably, last year, we saw a united West come together to intervene in Ukraine, not with troops on the ground like in Afghanistan or Iraq, but just with providing the support. Where does that go this year?
It's a test for NATO on its unity, but it's also a test for Joe Biden. Yep. Because President Biden set out his stall very early on in his presidency of being a leader of democracies, and that you should have a unity of democracies almost as an alternative to the United Nations. And he didn't know when he talked about that how that would be put to the test. And Ukraine is what's put it to the test. And at the moment, in his view, it's going pretty well. that democracies are supporting the Ukrainian cause. But he has problems at home now. He no longer controls Congress. And a lot of people on the Republican side in Congress, A, they want to mess up absolutely anything that Biden and the Democratic administration want to do. And B, some of them, are still following Donald Trump. And Donald Trump was very pro-Putin and quite pro-Russia and not at all pro-Ukraine. Mm-hmm. That was a big thing in the Trump administration. So he's going to have a hard time keeping that together. And that's another reason why this year is absolutely critical, because, of course, the following year is when you've got an American election.
And if the US domestic politics might affect this, is that also something we have to look to when it comes to Europe as well? I know there's presidential elections in Poland. I know there's been differences between Poland and Germany about Ukraine. I know in Austria, for example, there is a growing movement sort of against the war and against the cost of living. Should we be looking at that as well, the internal dynamics of Europe?
You should always look at the internal dynamics, and always internal politics are important. But I think that the fact that so far this has been a warmer winter than expected, and so the massive increase in the cost of fuel has not whipped up anti-war fever. And also European governments have pretty much all of them given grants to people to sort of take the edge off those cost of living increases. And so at the moment, I cannot identify a country where I think that's a real problem. The countries which were always ambivalent, like Hungary, for example, will continue to be ambivalent. But Poland, I think whichever party gets in, will always be with the Ukrainians against the Russians because of their recent history.
And just before we move on, I mean, how important as well when you talk about the war dragging on is the sense that, like with the 2014 conflict, that we in the West, we in the UK, start to lose interest.
It's very important. And that, again, is why this year is critical for Ukraine, because I think that interest can keep up through this year. But if you get to a point where it's a frozen conflict and where nothing is moving much, on the front lines, and where we faithless journalists who, looking around for the next big thing, start to move on and say, oh, well, it's the same this time as last time, that's news, that's what happens, then interest will diminish, sympathy will diminish, adherence to the cause of Ukraine will diminish. I mean, even when this ends, assuming it ends, wars do end eventually, trillions and trillions of dollars will need to be spent to rebuild Ukraine. So yes, it will be very hard to keep up Western support for all of that.
Do you think that the West, on one hand, is looking at this year to try and end it in some ways?
Yes, but I think that the West is more realistic than that. And some people think that this is a winnable war, and other people would say that Ukraine needs to get to a position where they can negotiate from a position of strength. Because even Zelensky himself says this will end in diplomacy. It will end in diplomacy. But there's a huge difference in the diplomacy if Ukraine has got back all of its territory or nearly all of its territory, or it hasn't. So that's what's to look out for in 2023. We haven't talked about Chinese support for Russia yet, but we're about to come on to that. But that obviously is also a critical factor.
Let's talk about China then, because at the end of last year, we saw Putin and Xi Jinping hold a video conference where they did pledge to deepen bilateral ties. But earlier in the year, I think sort of midway 2022, we did see Xi Jinping and even Narendra Modi in India sort of start to voice some grumblings about the ongoing war. Where do you see China now? I know that it's opening up its economy, it's trying to come back onto the international stage after, several years of being in a zero COVID policy, which saw Xi Jinping not travel, etc.
I see China looking inward now. So the zero COVID policy ended in ignominy, in the sense that it didn't work and they could no longer maintain it because people started to protest and because the economy was under such strain. And so now you have COVID whipping through China.
Overwhelmed by the sheer volume of patients. It's scenes like these, coupled with Beijing's unwillingness to share data on the situation, that prompted many countries, including the UK, to impose testing requirements on people arriving from China. The World Health Organization this week criticised China's lack of transparency, but officials insist they have the situation under control.
There's a possibility of 1 million people dying. There's a possibility of more than 1 million people dying. We will never know because they're no longer counting, because they don't want anybody to know. You can look back to, how many people died in the Cultural Revolution, how many people died in the Great Leap Forward. Well, they never said how many people died in the Great Leap Forward. It was probably 33 million, but it took decades for people to go through the records and try and understand that or calculate that. So I think that at the moment, Xi Jinping is very absorbed in consolidating his position and trying to get through this very difficult phase of the next few months when so many people are going to die of COVID. And then the economy. So you had a crisis in the real estate market. Now that has stabilized to some extent. But obviously economic growth has gone way down. And manufacturing has gone way down, as anybody trying to buy an iPhone or an iPad knows, because they're just not coming out of the Foxconn factories at the speed at which the world demands them. And you've also got President Biden has come up with this policy on semiconductor chips, because the world is so dependent on China, and trying to make sure that many of them are now made in America or in other places. And so all of these different things, I think, will absorb Xi Jinping quite acutely, certainly for the first part of the year. And Russia may be something of an irritant.
But how much does Russia rely on that relationship when it comes to them fighting the war?
Well, it's very important that China carries on buying Russian oil, and I don't think that's in danger. Russia will carry on buying Russian oil, and so will India. And those are the two big markets which make up for the European Union no longer buying Russian oil and gas. So I think that is the main thing. Obviously, he would like more support and more active support, and more active diplomatic support, but he can live with the level he's got at the moment.
And when it comes to Xi Jinping looking inwards more, does that also mean that he's not going to be focused on Taiwan as much, which again, just as we did see at the end of 2021, throughout 2022, we saw heightening of tensions there. Nancy Pelosi's visit, Kevin McCarthy, the new US House Speaker, says he might go there as well.
There's two ways of looking at that. One is he's got enough on his hands, and he has looked at what has happened with Ukraine and Russia, and he has understood that Russia has not found it as easy to prevail in Ukraine as it thought it would. And so lessons may be learned from that. And by the same token, in Taiwan, they are rearming, they are having longer military service. They are looking very much at this David and Goliath fight in Ukraine and saying, well, hang on, we should be like Ukraine too, and we need to prepare for that. So the one side says, no, that's not going to be a focus. But then the other way of looking at it, and in the last few days, there have been a lot of incursions by Chinese aircraft into Taiwanese airspace, which they, of course, say is not Taiwanese airspace, which is that things going a bit wobbly at home, nothing like a nationalistic cause to, up the enthusiasm of the populace. So I suppose what I think is that the rhetoric on Taiwan and these incursions will continue and at times will peak. But like last year, oh gosh, I'm doing the Mystic Meg. I don't think he's going to invade Taiwan. And they have said that they won't be ready to invade Taiwan until 2027. Anyway, they can blockade it.
But but what you're saying is almost a normalization of those heightened tensions. The excursions will carry on, the rhetoric will carry on,
yes,
etc. But it doesn't mean that we're any closer to war necessarily.
Yes. Can I tell you something, a factoid?
Of course.
About China.
We like facts.
Factoid. So you know how last year the world population reached 8 billion?
Yep.
Well, this year, 2023, according to the UN, is the year that India overtakes China as the most populous country. They both have about 1.4 billion people. But of course, the Chinese population, because of their very rigorous population policies, the one-child policy, which they no longer has, their rate of growth went right down. And the Indian population is still increasing. I just thought you'd like to know that.
How concerning is it? Because I know this was a question in Germany about Europe has weaned itself off Russia. How worrying is it for Europe to start relying perhaps too much on China, which they can eventually then use as leverage if they did?
Yes.
Not this year, but in the future, invade Taiwan.
Well, certainly that's something the Americans are worried about, because you've got this policy of decoupling, which started with Donald Trump and has continued with Joe Biden, which is that the American economy decoupling from the Chinese economy. Now, obviously, that's not completely possible because the two are very tied in together. But certainly the Americans are very concerned about, we've already talked about computer chips being reliant on China for computer chips. And rare earths, it's one of my little obsessions, rare earths, which are very important for all kinds of green technologies, whether those are, windmills or electric vehicles and all of these things. And the world is still 90% dependent on China for rare earths. And the Americans are very worried about that kind of thing. The Europeans are far less worried about all that. And I think that the Europeans, particularly the Germans, are like, we're already weaning ourselves off Russian oil. You're trying to wean us off Chinese technology as well. We can't do everything at once.
A lot of our chat has been about East versus West, as well as the global South. One country that is tied in, which is seen as a sort of conduit to the East and West, is Turkey. President Erdogan often sees himself as a route towards negotiations when it comes to Ukraine. There will be a general election in June. It's celebrating its 100th year of the establishment of its republic. How important will Turkey be this year, and should we be watching it?
You should definitely watch Turkey. Mind you should always watch Turkey, Kieran. I think that Turkey is the essential nation. Certainly when it comes to any kind of potential peace deal between Russia and Ukraine at the end of this year, maybe next year, maybe the year after. At the moment, the only sort of viable peacekeepers I could imagine who would be acceptable to both sides would be Turks, even though, of course, Turkey is a member of NATO. But Erdogan keeps up a relationship with Putin. But will Erdogan be there after April, after the election? Because that could make a big change. Because if he is unseated, and one has to say at the moment that is unlikely in that we don't know who the opposition candidate is going to be yet, and the opposition might be split, and he still, he controls the state and all the organs of state, and he certainly doesn't want to be beaten. So at the moment, the odds are on him. But if it was somebody else, they might not have those kind of, relationships with both sides, with Ukraine and Russia. On the other hand, 80% inflation in Turkey. People are pretty unhappy. So I guess the way he will try to ensure his continued government is by an armed attack on the Kurds. That's the way you normally do it, isn't it? Attack the Kurds and possibly an incursion into Syria to take back, or to get better control of the Kurdish areas of Syria. So I think we should definitely watch it, because there is a danger that there will be victims of his continued ambition, as there always are.
Talking of violent routes, another country we should discuss, and I know that you're keen to talk on, is Iran, where from September last year, following the death of Mahsa Amini in police custody for allegedly not wearing the hijab correctly, there have been these anti-government protests, the biggest and most widespread ever since the foundation of the Islamic Republic.
Sparked by the death of a young woman arrested for not wearing her headscarf correctly, they're now the most sustained challenge the regime has ever faced. And despite the risks, Iranians are still taking to the streets. Iran's authorities are accused of torturing detainees and coercing confessions.
The administration keeps on cracking down. It keeps on executing individuals.
Yeah.
What do you see happening there?
It's horrible. The protests will continue in one form or another, but maybe they will change form. The thing is, I don't see the overthrow of the regime in that when do regimes fall? Regimes tend to fall when the organs of the state, the police, the military, change sides. And that is very unlikely to happen because the Revolutionary Guard, the Basij, they are part of this Islamic system. And so they're not going to go on to the side of girls who don't want to wear hijab. So that's not going to happen. But there are other tensions in Iran. And I think there's a second part to this unrest in Iran, which is that although Persians are a majority, there are these different ethnic groups, Azeris, Kurds, Baluch, Arabs who are also pretty unhappy with the way they're being governed and much more likely to take up arms. Now, there's no evidence that Azeris are taking up arms at the moment, but the Baluch, the Kurds, some of them beginning to do that. So I think you could end up with, sort of multiple small conflicts.
Yep. I guess perhaps here in the West we haven't spoken about it as much, but if that does go down that possible route and the protests do continue, will there be much more intervention?
There has until recently been some possibility of the nuclear deal coming back on track. I think that is dead as an idea. And so therefore, I think that it's quite likely that the Iranians will start to rebuild their nuclear program. And they're coming to the end of an agreement about ballistic missiles. And there's the possibility, some people say the likelihood, that they will withdraw from the nuclear non-proliferation treaty this year. Now, what does that do? It's the perfect excuse for Israel to attack Iran. And you have now in Israel got a far right-wing government. Now, all Israeli governments are very anti-Iranian, but some are more actively anti-Iranian than others. And if they see a greater danger of Iran getting a nuclear weapon again, I think the possibility of an attack really increases. So that's one of the... We're going to talk at some point about my rogue elephants, which are ideas to look out for, of rogue elephants that rampage through the jungle, causing a lot of chaos and damage. And I'm looking at Israel and Iran.
Let's talk about those rogue elephants now to finish off. You've just mentioned Israel installing its most far-right government.
A little over a week since the new Israeli government was sworn in, and already Tel Aviv streets are filled with protesters. The new coalition is the most right-wing and religiously conservative government in its 74-year history, and have hit the ground running with plans to strengthen political influence in the courts and increase illegal settlements in the West Bank.
There are obviously also this year, there are other conflicts in Ethiopia, Yemen, ongoing troubles in Somalia with the drought, a humanitarian crisis in Haiti. We've just seen the storming of Congress in Brazil. I mean, those are some of them. What else are you looking at, Lindsey?
Well, I'm obviously looking at the Palestinians as well, because this government has already started to do things like ban the flying of the Palestinian flag in public and within Israel. And then you have this aged Palestinian leadership, which is so weak, and they can't really do anything. And of course, I'm not saying something's going to happen this year. These are trends, but the centre cannot hold. You cannot have an Israeli government which is more and more draconian and a complete failure of leadership amongst Palestinians and nothing to change. It's a very dangerous situation.
Is that because of a hardening amongst the Israeli population, or simply because of the PR system that makes it?
In the time I've been going to Israel, which is 20-something years, the population has become more and more hardline, and things have polarized, and the Palestinian population has become more militant as well. And then Central Asia, I think, is really interesting, because the Russian invasion of Ukraine, it moves other pieces around the map. So there was a sort of, what can you call it, a Pax Ruski in certain places. So, Russia prevailed, Kazakhstan. Well, Kazakhstan's got pretty pissed off with the Russians. They see it as destabilizing the region, this attack on Ukraine. And the Kazakhs allowed Russian men of conscription age to flee to Kazakhstan and get, I don't know if it was formal asylum, but to shelter there for a while. So that's interesting. And then Armenia and Azerbaijan. Now, Armenia has always had backing from Russia and Iran, two of its neighboring countries. Russia doesn't have the time to be dealing with Armenia at the moment. It's too busy invading Ukraine. And so there was a resurgence of the war between Azerbaijan and Armenia over the enclave of Nagorno-Karabakh, and Azerbaijan prevailed. Azerbaijan, backed by Turkey, has been arming itself more and more. I think it's highly possible knowing that Armenia won't have the support from Russia, or is unlikely to have it, that the Armenians may push further. You know, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, all of these places, they're not inherently stable. And so these changes in the region, I think, are quite destabilizing. And the other couple of things, Pakistan, you know, it's just got an IMF deal, which it needed. But, you know, Pakistan spent more in repaying its debt last year than it got in aid, even though the country is still parts of it underwater from those terrible floods, and with millions of people homeless and poor. And they have an election this year. And Imran Khan, who was pushed out of office by the army, is roaming across the country, getting up support. There was an assassination attempt against him. This is also a very unstable situation. And then I suppose the last one is a country which is very dear to your heart, I know, and that's South Africa.
Yep. And
you look at what's happened in the last couple of weeks. Eskom, the electricity company, state-owned electricity company, which already you have so much load shedding, which means that vast numbers of South Africans go without power for hours on end.
Yep.
And we're finding out more and more about the corrupt criminal gangs within Eskom, which are just looting and stealing and preventing it from working, to the point where the CEO had a cup of coffee, we learn, and it was laced with cyanide because he was trying to do something about corruption within Eskom. And Cyril Ramaphosa, the president who was supposed to take on the corruption of the years of Jacob Zuma, he has failed. Mm-hmm. He has just not managed to do it. And now South Africans I know are beginning to say, the ANC, forget it. So those are my rogue elephants, and I fear that there's going to be a lot of trampled trees in the jungle by this time next year.
Well, Lindsey Hilsum, I look forward to talking to you again this time next year.
Thank you, Kieran. It's a pleasure.